So we're going to jump straight to our guest. She is Alessandra Bocchi. She's here to discuss the migrant crisis and Italy's fantastic new populist government. She's a freelance journalist and she's worked in Libya and seen the origins of the migrant crisis firsthand. You can find her at Alessa Bocchi on Twitter. Alessandra, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, we're going to delve more into the background behind the migrant crisis, going to zoom out, and we'll talk about Italy if we get time. But starting with this breaking news, which I touched upon earlier, the Aquarius rescue ship, 600 migrants it was carrying along with some other ships. It was turned away by Italy. It didn't stop in its first port of call, which was Tunisia. Gee, I wonder why. But Spain's new socialist government allowed the ship to dock in Valencia. Tell us what happened in one area of Spain where some of these migrants from this ship were sent.
So yes, so these migrants were sent to this small city called Alicante in Spain, and they basically occupied a student building, but legally, this was sanctioned by the government. And this student building had students who were paying rent, like 750 euros rent per month, and they were evicted from this building. They were given, I think, 1 day notice. And these migrants were sent there because apparently they were afraid that they had diseases. And so they sent them to this building, but it doesn't really make sense. And this is the center of the city. So if these migrants really do have diseases, well, first of all, why are you letting them in the city? But also, why are you letting them in the center in a student building? It makes no sense.
So these students, they paid for their accommodation and they were basically told 24 hours, you're out, right?
Yes, there was one student who gave his testimony, a friend of mine, Cesare Sacchetti, he's a journalist who reported on this. He was given 1 day notice and he was there for a summer program to learn German. He had a job waiting for him in November in Germany, and he was evicted from his home basically, or his accommodation.
Yeah, we were rolling a video earlier out of Italy, and this was a couple of years ago. It was an old man, horrific video, chilling video. He owned a guest house, a small guest house. It was basically his own house. They bussed in migrants, the police did, and basically said that they were gonna requisition his property. Here you see the clip. House these migrants who just turned up in a van. And this old man, this poor old man, was saying, "Do you want to put them in my apartment too?" There's actually reports that he had suffered some kind of heart attack as this incident ended. Absolutely harrowing. We had Germany spending millions housing migrants in Berlin hotels while, they had 10,000 homeless people on the streets. Spain's got a huge unemployment problem right now. A lot of these European countries do. Why didn't this boat stop in Tunisia? What do you think the reason for that was?
Well, according to international law, any rescue operation in the Mediterranean, in this case it's with migrants, should go to the closest and safest ports, which in Libya's case would be Tunisia. However, they're bringing these migrants to Europe. They've been doing this for years now against international law. They pick up these migrants 12 kilometers from Libya's shores, so it's not even a rescue operation. They've been found colluding with the smugglers before. They literally pick them up from the smugglers' boats and put them on their NGO boats, and then they transport them to Europe because they're not concerned with saving lives. They actually are open border extremists, and they're willing to do everything to bring these migrants into Europe. This is their aim. It's not about saving lives. It's not about taking them to the safest place. It's not about respecting international law. It's about bringing as many migrants as they can to Europe.
And we're going to get into why that is shortly, but you've worked in Libya. You've seen this firsthand. Many quarters of the media are still describing these individuals as, war-torn or poverty-stricken refugees. You've seen it on the ground. Is it really accurate to describe the people that are getting in these boats that way?
No, it's not. Actually, in Italy, according to government statistics, only 8% of the applicants, which, by the way, are just a portion of the overall migrants, but 8% of those who have applied for asylum have been granted refugee status. So 92% of those who have applied are not actually refugees, and they're economic migrants. And so we hear the argument that, okay, well, they're not escaping war, but they're escaping poverty, so we should accept them anyways. That's like a justifiable reason to accept them into Europe. But really, they're not escaping poverty either. That's a big lie. I mean, some of them may perhaps, but it's a huge human trafficking network, and it's planned and it's organized. It's not spontaneous. People are coming all the way from Bangladesh. How does one come from Bangladesh into Europe? It makes no sense. They are being lured by these human traffickers who sell them a false dream of Europe. And they're doing this to the middle classes of those countries who can afford the journey, obviously. The poorer segments of those society cannot afford the journey. It's an expensive journey. You have to pay various human traffickers and militias in Libya. And so it's the middle classes from these countries, and it's actually hurting those countries because they are losing a lot of their human capital and potential, and it's also increasing corruption and sort of the black market in those countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brain drain. If you've got the middle class of a country leaving, then that's only going to harm that country in the long term as well. So it's not really benefiting anyone. Now, we're always lectured, on the right about how inhumane we are for opposing the rescue of, quote, refugees. My question, is it more inhumane to want to maintain the integrity of borders and law, God forbid, or is it more inhumane to incentivize these journeys that are guaranteed to end in death for thousands of people? Who's being more inhumane here?
Well, obviously, if Europe didn't have open borders in the first place, these people wouldn't be risking their lives for this journey. There wouldn't be a human trafficking network to incentivize these people to make this perilous journey. So it's definitely the fact that there are open borders. That's the main reason why these people are risking their lives for a false dream, may I add, of Europe, because they get into Europe, they can't find a job, there are no jobs. There isn't enough welfare for Europeans themselves. And many of them, yes, die in the Mediterranean. So it's really a tragedy.
And we have stories like the one out of Germany today, obviously huge problems with crime. We had the murderer of a 14-year-old girl fled the country. They got him back in the end. Now it's coming out that he was bragging about how great everything was in Germany. They gave him money, they gave him welfare. So we're going to talk about that as well. But looking at Italy, obviously you're Italian. We had the success of the populist government recently after they tried to override it with a technocrat. We can talk about that. The Financial Times, the globalist paper of record, described this coalition as barbarians. Was the vote in Italy a reaction to just the problems caused by mass migration, or was it a wider rejection of how the EU has worsened the country economically?
No, so what the English-speaking media, I think, or the establishment media has failed to address, in part because Brexit was mostly driven by migration and there wasn't really an economic problem as much there. But there is a huge economic crisis plaguing Southern Europe, which has been largely ignored. And it started with Greece a few years ago, and the Troika, meaning the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank have imposed these austerity measures on Southern European countries for them to pay back their debt, basically. And, Greece voted against those austerity measures, but they imposed them nonetheless. And it's really what is also ignored is the fact that the EU is dominated by Germany. And right now it's a project that is serving Germany's interests at the expense of Southern European countries like Greece and Italy. And the European Union, as well as Germany, thought they could ignore Greece because it's a relatively small country. It doesn't have as much power to really stand up for itself. But with Italy, they cannot ignore the crisis any longer, because if Italy is out of the European Union, I think the whole project would collapse at this point. Italy is a founding member, so they're really quite worried now. And what struck me was that Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, actually admitted, he said, we're not going to treat Italy like we treated Greece. So they openly admitted that they've been treating Greece terribly. And they're not doing
we'll
that.
Be back. Hold that thought, Alessandra. We'll be back. This is the Fourth Hour Live, Infowars.com. Don't go away. And we are back with our guest, Alessandra Bocchi. She is at Alessa Bocchi on Twitter. She's a freelance journalist talking about the migrant crisis, talking about the rise of Italy's populist government. And on the subject of Italy, you know, Italy's native population is in decline. It's basically the same story all across Europe. Fertility rates generally are dropping. Now, how do you respond to the claim? Because this was a claim that was made by Merkel and others at the outset of this latest wave of mass immigration, that we need to import migrants so they can supplement the workforce, you know, pay taxes and fund these social welfare programs that may otherwise collapse. Alessandra, don't we need these people? Because we're dying out. Don't we need them to replace us and to work and to pay taxes? That makes sense, right?
Um, no, actually, that makes no sense because most of these people are not working. They are their lives are being paid for by the government with EU funds, by the way, and they're living in these. At least in Italy, it's a bit different, perhaps in Northern Europe, but in Italy, they're living in these large cooperatives, and there are these sort of camps, migrant camps, where they have everything paid for, and they're not integrated in society. They're not working. They're not doing anything. I visited some of these camps, and the migrants have themselves told me that they were really bored with their lives and they didn't know what to do, and they wish that they had a job. So that's not the case. Actually, the reason why, at least in Italy, people are not having children is because of the, I would say, economic crisis mostly. You have almost 40% youth unemployment in Italy overall, and in some southern regions, it goes up to 60%, which is crazy. Like, most young people are not working at all. They're not doing anything. There are no jobs. So how are you going to find jobs for migrants when there aren't enough jobs for Italians themselves who are educated, who went to school here, and these migrants who don't know the language are supposed to find a job instead?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers, when you look at them, are outrageous. 3% of the initial migrant wave into Germany from 2015 got jobs. Only 3%. You know, you can look at Sweden. 58% of welfare payments go to immigrants. More than half of German welfare recipients come from migrant backgrounds. In the Netherlands, 85% of refugees remain unemployed 4 years later because there's little financial incentive to move off unemployment welfare into unskilled work. So there's not even that much difference. So why would they bother? Which again goes back to the point, you can't have a giant welfare state and have mass immigration at the same time. Eventually it's just going to collapse, right? It doesn't work.
Yes, it does not work at all. They don't know how to solve this issue, and it's just being used as a pretext to let more people in because they're so they've entered like this crisis now where they don't know how to deal with it anymore. But in some cases, I would say that it is an occasion to have more cheap labor into the country because many European countries have developed worker protection laws that would not apply to illegal immigrants. So a lot of these migrants are being basically used as slaves to be exploited instead of Europeans or the European working class, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so again, they're the great humanitarians, but they're actually exploiting people and making them into slaves. They don't have to abide by the same kind of regulations with a lot of these people. A lot of it's on the black market. So again, it's just complete exploitation. Oh, but we're inhumane. We're the ones who are bad. Anyway, let's talk about Macron, because this was a very interesting thing that he came out with back in April. He said mass migration was Europe's destiny, and the plan was to turn Europe into your Africa. He actually said this. Now, he was citing the words of a French-American journalist and professor called Stephen Smith, who said that the number of Africans living in Europe will grow from 9 million, which is around what it is now, apparently, to between 150 million and 200 million within the next 30 years. Alessandra, can European countries retain their identity if we import hundreds of millions of Africans over the next few decades? Surely, if you import Africa, then you become Africa, right?
Yes, it makes no sense. Like, of course, if there are a few people coming in small numbers, like some Africans have always existed in Europe, some Europeans have always existed in Africa. The problem is when you have a mass migration of people who are being brought there, it's like a design, it's purposely made to replace the native people, European people. So it's bringing like this cultural clash between Europeans and Africans, and we're already seeing this unfolding. You know, accusations of racism, people being beat up. There was a case before the election in Italy where this young Italian girl, 19-year-old, she was killed, raped, and mutilated. Her body was put in 2 separate bags. And this triggered a reaction by one Italian man who decided to shoot at random Black people on the street as a revenge. So it's causing a lot of conflict. It's just like a war, an ethnic war, and in a way it's a war between poor people, you know, the poorest segments of both societies.
So what do you think is the overarching agenda here? Because we know they want cheap labor, but again, we know that they can't bring in workforce that will cover that deficit in terms of, you know, a labor force. Is there some kind of malevolent agenda about the replacement of Westerners in general, or are we just talking about people who, I mean, I've often looked at where these big celebrities and big campaigners live, the ones who are very pro-refugee, very pro-mass immigration, and they always live in the whitest areas of London, for example, possible, the whitest areas possible. In Sweden, they had a study of Swedish left-wing politicians. They all lived in the whitest enclaves possible in major Swedish cities. So obviously we know they're virtue signalers, we know they're hypocrites, we know they don't even want to live amongst the conditions that they create.